Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you believed about your family was a lie. Edward's world is shattered when an unimaginable tragedy strikes, but what happens next will leave you speechless. You won't believe the shocking truth that unfolds. Stay tuned to the end. This is a story you have to see to believe. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The air in the small, dimly lit house felt heavier than usual. Silence hung thick in every room, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Edward sat at the edge of his bed, his face buried in his hands. His breathing was shallow, his fingers trembling slightly as his mind tried to process the impossible news. His mother, Lilia, was gone. The words echoed in his head like a cruel chant he couldn't escape. She passed away in her sleep, his father, Mark, had said, with a tone so flat, so indifferent, it made Edward's stomach turn. He glanced toward the hallway where his father sat at the dining table, scrolling on his phone as if nothing had happened. No tears, no grief, no sign of loss. It didn't sit right with Edward. His mother had been full of life, always humming her favorite gospel tunes while cooking or watering her plants. She was strong, full of warmth and light. She didn't just pass away in her sleep. People like her didn't just stop existing. Edward rose from his bed, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart pounded with an overwhelming sense of doubt and anger. He had questions, and it was time for answers. He stormed into the dining room, his eyes locked on his father, who barely glanced up from his phone. "Why aren't we doing anything?" Edward's voice cracked with frustration. "She's gone, and you're just sitting there like it's another Tuesday." Mark's eyes shifted slowly from his phone to his son, his gaze cold and distant. "She's gone, Edward. There's nothing to do. People die every day." "That's it?" Edward's voice rose. "That's all you have to say? She was your wife, my mother, and you want to bury her tomorrow without even finding out why she died?" He shook his head, eyes blazing with disbelief. "We should have an autopsy done. We need to know what happened." Mark leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing into sharp slits. "No, we don't. She's at peace now. Let her rest." "Rest?" Edward's voice was nearly a shout now. "You think it's peaceful to be buried without answers? You think I'm just going to stand by and watch you put her in the ground like she's trash?" Mark's jaw tightened, his fingers pressing hard against the table. "Watch your mouth, boy. I'm still your father." "Then act like it," Edward snapped, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Act like you care she's gone. Act like you cared about her at all." The tension in the room was thick, like a storm ready to break. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mark's eyes were locked on his son's, both filled with a stubborn rage neither of them wanted to yield. Finally, Mark leaned back, exhaling slowly. "We're burying her tomorrow. No autopsy, no investigations. That's the end of it," Mark said with finality, his voice cold as steel. "You don't like it? Too bad. I'm the one making the decisions here." Edward felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't describe. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was suspicion. It was doubt. His eyes stayed on his father for a moment longer, searching his face for something, anything, that would make this make sense. But all he saw was a man who didn't care. And that terrified him more than anything. That night, Edward barely slept. His mind was consumed by memories of his mother's smile, the sound of her voice calling him to dinner, the way she always knew when something was wrong with him. She was so aware of everything, so present, and now she was just gone? It didn't add up. His father's behavior didn't add up. The way Mark dismissed his questions felt wrong. Off. There had been too many late-night phone calls, too many arguments between his parents in the weeks leading up to this. He tossed and turned, his heart racing with thoughts he couldn't shake. His eyes darted to the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:14 a.m. His mind was set. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. The next morning, as the sun peeked through the blinds, Edward was already dressed. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, his movements stiff from exhaustion. But his mind was clear. He knew exactly what he needed to do. At 7 a.m., Edward arrived at the cemetery. His heart pounded like a drum, his hands gripping the handle of a rusty old shovel he'd taken from the shed behind the house. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the area. The grounds were quiet. The only movement was the slow swaying of trees in the distance. No one was watching. No one could stop him. He approached the fresh mound of dirt where his mother had been buried just hours ago. The ground still looked unsettled, the soil dark and soft. His breathing was shallow, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and sorrow. He stabbed the shovel into the dirt with a grunt. The sound of the blade piercing the soil echoed louder than he expected. His hands gripped the handle tightly as he pulled out the first scoop of dirt and tossed it aside. Then another, and another. His muscles burned, his back ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" a voice called from behind him. Edward's heart leapt in his chest. He spun around to see a man approaching. It was a security guard, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a gray uniform. His face was twisted into a look of disgust as he marched toward Edward with quick, angry steps. "Step away from that grave," the guard barked, reaching for the walkie-talkie on his hip. "I'm calling the police right now, you hear me?" "Call them," Edward shouted back, his voice filled with defiance. "This is my mother's grave, and I'm going to see her." "I don't care whose grave it is," the guard sneered. "I see a black man digging up a grave. I call the cops. Plain and simple." Edward's chest heaved with fury. His grip on the shovel tightened as he stepped forward. "Don't you touch me. Don't you dare touch me." "Or what?" The guard stepped in close, his face inches from Edward's. "You think you scare me, boy? You think you can do what you want just 'cause you're mad? You're about to learn real quick that ain't how it works." The guard grabbed Edward's arm, yanking it hard. Edward's instincts kicked in. He pulled away, his free hand shoving the guard back with more force than he realized. The man stumbled, his face twisting with rage. "Oh, you done it now," the guard hissed, pulling out his walkie-talkie. "Yeah, I got a black male, mid-20s, causing a disturbance at the cemetery. Might be violent. Send backup." Edward felt his heart drop. His eyes darted back to the grave. He was so close. He couldn't stop now. "No, no, no," Edward muttered, his breathing quickening. "I have to see her. I have to see her." The wail of police sirens echoed in the distance. Edward looked back at the guard, whose smirk grew wider as he noticed the sound. "End of the line, kid," the guard said, cracking his knuckles. "Cops'll be here any minute. Better get on your knees before they put you there." Minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up with flashing blue and red lights. 2 officers stepped out, both white, both looking at Edward like he was already guilty of something. Their eyes scanned him, the grave, and the guard who stood behind him. "Hands up! Hands up now!" one officer barked, unholstering his weapon. Edward raised his hand slowly, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He stared into the eyes of the officer, his own filled with a silent fury. "I'm not a criminal," Edward said, his voice low but firm. "That's my mother in that grave. I'm just trying to see my mother." "Get on the ground." The officer pointed his gun. "Down. Face down, now." Edward hesitated, his eyes darting from the officer to the grave. "I'm not a threat," he said, his voice cracking. "I just want to see my mom." "On the ground." The officer's shout echoed in the quiet cemetery. Edward's knees hit the dirt. His face pressed against the cold, damp ground. The weight of a boot pressed against his back, forcing him down harder. His heart pounded, his face wet with tears and dirt. But even as they pinned him down, his eyes stayed locked on that grave. He wouldn't give up. Not yet. Edward's face pressed against the cold dirt, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The pressure of the officer's knee on his back sent sharp pain up his spine, but the pain was nothing compared to the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His cheek was smeared with soil, his eyes locked on the grave just a few feet away. He could still see the edge of the coffin's lid poking through the freshly dug soil. So close. So close, but they wouldn't let him finish. "Stop resisting," barked one of the officers as he tightened the cuffs around Edward's wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, and he winced, but he refused to let out a sound of pain. They wanted him to break. They wanted him to beg, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "I'm not resisting," Edward yelled, his face half buried in the dirt. "That's my mother. She's in there. I have to see her." His voice cracked with desperation, but the officers didn't care. Yeah, save it for the judge," one of the officers sneered, digging his knee in harder before finally pulling Edward to his feet. "You grave robbers always have some sob story. Oh, it's my mother. Oh, it's my grandmother. I've heard it all before." Edward's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth felt like they'd crack. His eyes burned with rage and disbelief. "I'm telling you the truth," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "Call the cemetery records. Call the funeral home. My mother was just buried yesterday." "Shut up," barked the taller officer, yanking Edward toward the police cruiser. "You think your story's gonna change anything? News flash, buddy. You're just another thug in handcuffs. Get used to it." Edward's eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, who might help him. His gaze landed on the security guard, Robert, who stood by the grave with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Tell them," Edward yelled toward him. "You know I'm telling the truth. You saw me. You know that's my mom in that grave." Robert shrugged, his eyes cold and indifferent. "I don't know what you're talking about, kid. I just saw you digging where you ain't supposed to be digging." Edward's heart stopped for a second. He stared at Robert, his chest heaving. "Liar," he whispered, his voice trembling with fury. "You know the truth. You know it." "Yeah, well, truth don't pay my bills," Robert muttered, glancing away. Edward's mind felt like it was spinning. His whole world was crashing down around him, betrayal from his father, from this stranger, from the system that was supposed to protect him. His hands clenched into fists behind his back, the cold metal of the cuffs cutting into his skin. But he didn't care. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was this close. "Get in the car," one of the officers barked, shoving him toward the cruiser. Edward stumbled, catching himself just before his knees hit the ground. The officer grabbed him by the collar and shoved him harder, slamming him face first into the side of the car. The cold metal of the vehicle's surface sent a sharp chill through his body. "Stop struggling," the officer hissed in his ear, pressing him against the car with his full weight. Edward breathed in through his nose, his eyes squeezed shut in frustration. "I'm not struggling," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm telling you, she's alive." The officer laughed, the sound sharp and mean. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Get in the car, Your Highness." They shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser, and the door slammed shut behind him with a loud clang. The moment the door locked, Edward's head fell back against the seat. His eyes stared up at the roof of the car, unblinking, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He wanted to scream. He wanted to punch something, but he knew that's exactly what they wanted him to do. Another angry black man moment for them to justify every cruel thing they did. He wasn't going to give them that. Not today. His eyes stayed on the cemetery as the car pulled away. His heart ached as he watched the grave disappear from view. His mother was still there, alone, buried, trapped. His stomach twisted at the thought. If she was still alive, then every second counted. Every second she was still underground could be her last. The ride to the station felt endless. The officers sat in the front, casually chatting about their weekend plans as if Edward weren't even there. He sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the glass, his own tired, defeated eyes looking back at him. At the station, they dragged him out of the car like a sack of garbage. His feet barely touched the ground before one of them shoved him forward. "Move it, tough guy," the officer sneered, pulling him through the station doors. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, the cold white glow making everything feel sterile and lifeless. The moment they stepped inside, Edward's heart skipped. People turned to look at him, officers, clerks, detainees, all eyes on him, the black man in cuffs. Some of them smirked, others whispered. One officer snickered and said, "Another one, huh?" They led him to a bench, unshackled him from the cuffs, and replaced them with a chain that bolted him to the wall like a caged animal. He sat there, his head down, his eyes burning holes into the floor. He could hear the officers joking about him a few feet away, their laughter low but sharp. "Dug up a whole grave, huh?" one of them muttered. "Bet he thought he was going to find treasure." "Treasure? Nah," said another with a laugh. "Bet he was looking for drugs. Ain't that what they always do?" Edward clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles turned white. He bit down on his lip until he tasted blood. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. He wasn't sure anymore. He stared ahead, not moving, not blinking. His mind played the scene from the cemetery over and over again. He could still see the edge of the coffin. He could still feel the dirt under his nails. His heart thudded with a single, clear thought. She's still down there. "Edward Harris," a voice called. He looked up slowly, his eyes sharp and focused. A detective stood in front of him, a folder in his hand. He was older, with a wrinkled face and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't look like the others. He looked tired. "Come with me," the detective said, unlocking Edward's chain. He followed, his eyes darting left and right, watching every officer as they eyed him. He was led to a small, cold room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The detective sat on one side. Edward sat on the other. The detective placed the folder on the table and opened it. Photos spilled out, photos of his mother, Lilia, lying peacefully in her coffin. His throat tightened, but he didn't look away. "I've been reviewing the burial records," the detective said, tapping on the folder. "Your story checks out. Your mother was buried yesterday." Edward's eyes snapped up. "Then why am I here?" "Because you broke the law," the detective said, leaning forward. "But I'm not blind. I see something else going on here. So tell me, son, why do you think your mother is still alive?" Edward stared at him. For the first time since all this started, someone was listening. "Because I saw her," Edward whispered, his voice hoarse. "I saw her chest moving. I saw her breathing. She's alive." The detective tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any proof of that?" Edward leaned forward, his eyes fierce and unyielding. "Look at her," he said, pointing to one of the photos. "Her face, look at it. Does she look dead to you?" The detective glanced down at the photo. His eyes squinted slightly. "I've seen dead bodies," Edward continued, his voice rising. "I've seen what they look like. She's not dead." The detective sat back, rubbing his jaw. He glanced at the door, then at Edward. For a moment, there was silence. "I'll make some calls," the detective finally said. "Stay here." Edward watched him leave the room. His heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of hope. He sat alone, staring at the door. "Don't stop now," he thought. "Don't stop now." Edward sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his eyes locked on the door. His heart was pounding in his chest, every beat a reminder that time was slipping away. His mother was still in that coffin, still underground, and every second that passed felt like another step closer to losing her for good. His fingers drummed anxiously against the metal table, the faint clinking of the chain on his wrist the only sound in the room. His mind replayed the scene at the grave over and over, the flash of her face through the open lid, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. He knew it. He saw it. But knowing wasn't enough. He needed someone to believe him. The door finally swung open with a slow creak, and Detective Cole stepped back in, holding a paper cup of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He glanced at Edward, his face unreadable, and sat down across from him. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sipped his coffee, his eyes fixed on the table as if he were trying to organize his thoughts. Edward's patience was gone. "Did you call them?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Did you call the hospital? Did you call the cemetery?" Detective Cole raised his eyes, tilting his head slightly. "I made a call," he said slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Spoke to the funeral director. He said your mother's body was prepared, embalmed, and buried according to protocol." "That's a lie," Edward snapped, his fist slamming onto the table. "She wasn't embalmed. She wasn't dead. I saw her breathing. I saw it with my own eyes." "Calm down, Edward," the detective said, leaning forward, his eyes sharper now. "I'm trying to help you, but if you keep yelling, you're only going to make it worse." "Worse for who?" Edward shot back, his eyes blazing with fury. "For me? My mother is buried alive, and you're telling me to calm down? You think I care about looking calm right now?" Detective Cole's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair. He set the coffee cup down slowly and folded his arms. "Listen to me, kid," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen desperate men before. You're not the first. But you need to give me more than just, 'I saw it.' You understand? I can't walk into a cemetery and dig up a grave just because you say so." "Then look at the medical report," Edward said, his voice rising in desperation. "There's no way they embalmed her. No way. If they had, she wouldn't be breathing. You know that. Check the report." Detective Cole glanced at him, his fingers tapping slowly on the table. For a moment, silence filled the room again. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than ever. Edward could feel his patience hanging by a thread. Then, without a word, Cole stood up and left the room. Edward leaned forward, his head resting in his hands. The walls around him felt like they were closing in. He stared at the one-way mirror, knowing someone on the other side was watching him like a caged animal. His mind raced with thoughts of his father, of the look in Mark's eyes when he said, "She's gone, let it go." Those words haunted him. He knew his father was hiding something. He knew it in his bones. But no one believed him. Not the cops, not the guard, not even Detective Cole. Minutes turned into an hour. His throat was dry, and his wrists were sore from the cuffs. Just as he was about to shout for someone to come in, the door opened again. This time, Cole wasn't alone. Another man entered, wearing a gray suit and carrying a brown folder under his arm. He was older, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that scanned Edward like he was a puzzle to be solved. "Edward Harris," the man said, glancing at a paper in his folder. "You've caused quite a stir, son." "Who are you?" Edward asked, his voice filled with exhaustion and suspicion. "Name's Agent Brooks," the man said, sitting across from him. "I work with Internal Affairs. Heard your story. Gotta say, it's unusual." "I don't care if it's unusual," Edward said through clenched teeth. "I care that my mom is still breathing underground while you all sit here wasting time." "Easy, son," Brooks said, holding up a hand. "I've already called the funeral home myself. They're rechecking the embalming records as we speak." Edward's eyes widened with hope. "Then you'll see. You'll see I'm telling the truth." "Maybe," Brooks said, glancing at the file. "Or maybe you're seeing what you want to see. Grief makes people see things that aren't there." "It wasn't grief," Edward's voice boomed, echoing off the concrete walls. "She was breathing. I saw her chest move. I'm not crazy." Agent Brooks eyed him for a long moment, his gaze unflinching. Then, as if making a decision, he pulled out his phone and made a call right in front of Edward. He spoke in short, clipped sentences that Edward couldn't make out. But when he hung up, there was a change in his face. His eyes darted to Detective Cole. "Get the coroner," Brooks said firmly. "Now." Detective Cole didn't question it. He walked out of the room quickly, his eyes sharp with focus. Edward watched him go, his heart hammering in his chest. "What did they say?" Edward asked, his breath short and quick. "What did they tell you?" Brooks didn't answer at first. He stared at Edward with a look of curiosity, like he was finally starting to believe him. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Edward's. "They didn't embalm her," Brooks said quietly. "The paperwork says they planned to, but it never happened. Some kind of clerical error." Edward felt his whole body go numb. His breath caught in his throat, his vision blurring with a rush of tears. He knew it. He knew it. She was alive. "Now you believe me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I believe something ain't right," Brooks admitted, rubbing his jaw. "We're going to the cemetery." 15 minutes later, Edward sat in the back of a black SUV, his hands free for the first time since his arrest. Agent Brooks drove in silence, his eyes focused on the road. Detective Cole sat in the passenger seat, tapping his fingers on his knee. They pulled up to the cemetery just as the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, but there was no beauty in it for Edward. His eyes were locked on one thing, the spot where his mother was buried. A small group of men with shovels were already at work, digging up the grave. Edward jumped out of the car, his legs moving faster than he realized. He ran toward the grave, his heart thudding in his chest. "Move!" he yelled at the workers. "Let me see her!" "Back up, son," one of the workers said, raising his hand. "We got it." But Edward didn't back up. He watched every scoop of dirt being pulled away, every inch closer to the truth. His breath hitched as the lid of the coffin became visible. "Open it," Brooks ordered. "Now." One of the workers used a crowbar, prying open the lid with a loud creak. The moment the lid lifted, Edward felt his heart stop. His breath caught in his throat. His legs almost gave out beneath him. There she was, his mother, Lilia. Her face was pale but not lifeless. Her chest rose and fell slowly, barely noticeable, but it was there. She was breathing. "Mom!" Edward shouted, dropping to his knees. "Mom, I'm here! It's me! It's Edward!" Gasps echoed around the cemetery. One of the workers stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "She's alive," he muttered, his voice trembling. "She's still alive." "Get the paramedics," Brooks barked. "Now!" Edward reached into the coffin, his hands shaking as he touched his mother's face. It was warm. Warm. Tears poured down his face as he whispered, "I told you, Mom. I told you I'd find you." Lilia's eyes fluttered open just for a second. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "Edward," she said weakly, her voice like a breath of air. "I'm here, Mom," Edward cried, his tears falling on her face. "I'm right here." The wail of ambulance sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder. Edward didn't care. He held her hand, his grip unyielding. "I'm never letting you go again," he said, his voice firm but full of love. "Never again." What an incredible journey this story has been. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, everything changed in an instant. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more powerful stories like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. We love hearing from you. See you in the next video.